With the update 32 Deadlands, PvE Magic DPS users have seen a lot of change. Now monster helms can critically strike, and we have a cap on critical damage of 125%. Additionally, the hybridization of gear sets means that there's much more variety in gear choices, and some of the top performers that were relegated to stam-only builds are now meta for Magicka. That begs the question, what gear should you use and why? Thankfully, I have some answers. In this video, I'm going to show and discuss some gear loadouts that you can run regardless of the class, with flexible options that are easy to obtain. If you like this type of video and find it helpful, make sure to click that like and subscribe, as well as leave me a comment on your gear setup. Meta gear for Magic PvE DPS. Buckle up, let's go. The first important thing you need to make a decision on in your gear loadout is, do you run a Mythic or do you run a Monster Helm? Both have pros and cons. Let me explain why and my thought process on what I chose. There are two strong choices right now for Mythics. Harpooner's Kilt, which is primarily used for range, long duration fight. When you deal direct damage, you gain a stack, increasing your crit chance and your crit damage. The downside of this is when you take direct damage, you're going to lose up to 5 stacks at a time. So if you're in the back and you're doing a very long trial fight where you can maintain 10 max stacks for a very long time, this is a great performing one-piece Mythic. The downside is it struggles in mobile fights, dungeons, or any situation where you're frequently taking damage because the stacks fall off when you're taking direct damage. Think also up-close melee types, magic dealers like a Magic Templar or a Dragonite. It's just not a good choice currently. Another really good choice is Death Dealer's Fate, because after a minute of consistent combat, you'll be rewarded with 2,680 max stats across the board. That's magic, health, and stamina. The max magic increases your damage and shields, while the max health allows you to use a variety of food choices and basically become more survivable. Meanwhile, the extra stamina is nice for dodge rolling, blocking, or interrupting. However, I've switched out of the Mythic sets for a Monster Helm. And one Monster Helm that's really rocking and rolling right now is Kelnar's Nightmare from Unhollow Grave Veteran Dungeon. This set gives weapon and spell damage as a one-piece, and the two-piece does the following. Damaging an enemy with a light attack puts a bone stack on them for 5 seconds. At 5 stacks, an undodgeable skeleton hand attacks your enemy after 1 second, knocking them air, stunning them for 3 seconds, and doing a ton of magic damage if they cannot be stunned. This damage scales off your higher weapon or spell damage. This set's tooltip is super high, and now that it can critically strike, it's usually about 5 to 7%, even 8% of your total damage in some fight. Putting this on over Harpooners, I can honestly feel an impact because it works in dungeons, arenas, high mobility fights, stationary fights, long fights, you name it. It's just a great set and forget option. Another good option if you don't have access to this DLC or you want something more applicable in big AoE fights is a long time forgotten set, Narayaneth. This was best in slot years ago, and now since Monster Helms can critically strike, another good option. The one piece gonna give a spell and the two piece, when dealing direct damage, you have a 15% chance to summon a Lich Crystal that explodes after 2 seconds, dealing magic damage to all enemies within 4 meters. This effect can occur once every 3 seconds and scales off of higher weapon or spell damage. The strength of this set is that any direct damage can proc this effect, and it's AoE. In large ad pulls, it's a great choice, not to mention it can proc so frequently, seeming to always be up. However, I prefer the damage coming from Kelnar's, and I use my Monster Helm setup rather than using Harpooner's Kilt or Death Dealer's Fate. Throw this on and you can really feel the damage. So that's step 1. We're gonna go with the Monster Helm. Let's talk about the 5-piece body sets and why and what you should choose from. The previous simple gear loadout that I was running and many others was 5-piece Mother Sorrow on the body at all times with 5-piece Medusa on the front bar and jewelry. While this combination still works, there are better choices. Stick with that loadout until you get some of the items I'm going to mention here. Your primary goal on the body is to obtain a Trials damage dealing magic set so it can be quote-unquote on at all times. The best choice right now is Perfected Bahase's Mania from Blackwood's Trial Rock Grove, or non-perfected from the normal version. The 3-piece is very important, giving you Minor Slayer at all times, increasing your damage done to dungeons, trials, and arena monsters by 5%. This buff can stack with other damage amps like Minor and Major Berserk, more on that later. The 5-piece is where this really shines, increasing your damage done to non-player enemies up to 15% based on your missing magic. So even if you're at 50% of your magic pool, that's 7.5% increased damage. You guessed it, This stacks with Minor, Major Slayer, Minor, and Major Berserk, adding a ton of raw damage. When playing all the classes with this loadout, I needed to change up my food, champion points, and skills to make sure I didn't consistently run out of magic, but bounce between about 25 to 50% magic for optimal damage and sustain. For food choices, I went with Clockwork Citrus Fillet, increasing my max health and magic recovery and max magic. Champion points, I did not take Rejuvenation, though kept siphoning spells for some Magicka back on kill. Skills, the most important change that I ran was Mystic Orbs. It's a high cost Magicka AoE damage over time effect, but the most important thing, it can be cast without a target. How I would use this is between pulls. I could spam this repeatedly for basically a magic drain. Then I would start combat out at around 50% magic or lower to ensure I got the most damage out of this 5-piece set on my body. You can use this skill from Undaunted skill line or another in your class kit, but make sure you have some high Magicka cost dump that can be used without a target. Another option here is Perfected Mantle of Sororia. You can obtain this in Veteran Cloud Rest or normal for non-perfected version. This set 3-piece will also grant that important Minor Slayer, and the 5-piece is a ton of damage if you can reliably keep the proc up. The 5-piece here deals damage with light or heavy attacks. Create a ring of fire beneath you for 10 seconds. This effect can occur every 10 seconds. Standing in the ring grants you a stack of Sororia's Boon for 5 seconds up to a max of 10 time. Each stack increases your weapon and spell damage by 52. So essentially in non-mobile fights, if you can stand still in this ring, just indefinitely light attack weaving without interruptions, you're gonna have a crazy amount of damage. The downside is, well, if you're doing a dungeon, arena, or a trial with heavy mechanics and movement, you'll lose the stacks and effectiveness, and this thing just doesn't see a whole lot of damage. However, certain trials and stationary fights, this is a great alternative. Last trial set up here that I'd recommend is Perfected False God's Devotion. This is from Veteran Sunspire or normal for non-perfected version. 3-piece also is going to grant you Minor Slayer, increasing your damage done to dungeon trials and arena bosses by 5%. And the 5-piece is going to basically make you sustain infinitely. Reduce the cost of your magic abilities by 8%, which is huge. And when an enemy dies, you're going to restore 2,454 Magicka and gain Major Expedition for 8 seconds. And this effect can occur once every 1 second. This is my go-to option for solo arenas due to the speed gain and the sustain it provides. Will you lose damage in comparison to Bahases? Yes, but it's much less complex, much easier to obtain resources, and can be quite effective for newer players or folks that want to be super survivable, like my 2-button Magic Templar build that beat VMA with, well, you guessed it, 2 buttons. And if you're unable to get into trials or don't like doing them, just stick with something very simple like Mother's Sorrows. This is a 5-piece set that you can put on your body. You can obtain it in the Overland Ashan or buy it in the traders for very, very cheap, and is a great staple in Magicka DPS. But my best in slot is Perfected Bahases, and if you can get your build right, it's an absolute nuclear missile. Moving to the new information, and that's the front bar sets that were previously only used on stamina builds. Remember how I talked about the hybridization of gear sets? Take Kinra's Wrath, for example, coming from Black Drake Villa. This set previously 2 through 4-piece only gave weapon damage and weapon critical. Well, now it's going to give spell damage and critical across the board, so including spell critical. And now Kinra's is one of, if not the best front bar set that you can run on any class. Let me explain. So the Trials set is going to give us that important buff Minor Slayer on our body, so we don't need necessarily another Trials set on our weapons, and that's why it makes Dungeon set a great choice to choose from. Kinra's Wrath 5-piece effect, dealing damage with light or heavy attack, grants you a stack of Burning Heart for 5 seconds up to 5 stack. While you have 5 stacks, you generate an Aura of Wrath, granting you Major Berserk, increasing your damage done by 10%. While you have the Aura of Wrath, allies within 12 meters will also be granted Minor Berserk, increasing their damage done by 5%. While this sounds good, there are some major considerations to use when using this set. If you can maintain the 5 stacks at all times, this is going to be a home run due to Major Berserker provides you and the Minor Berserker provides people around you, giving you some group utility. Not to mention, if another person is using this set, you're going to get Minor Berserk as well if you're in that area. The downside is you must be precise with your light attack weaves, otherwise the stacks will fall off, losing a 10% major berserk and taking a while to get that berserk back up. So let's think about this logically. Each skill in ESO has a global cooldown of 1 second, meaning if you click, let's say, Force Pulse, you have 1 second animation until you can do another attack. Add a light weave attack in between there, and this is a little bit more time. This is relevant because when you go onto your back bar, you only want 3 damage over time effects or buffs because you'll need to swap quickly back to your front bar in order to maintain this buff via light attack. How this works in reality is light attack, ability, light attack, ability, light attack, ability, bar swap cancel with the light attack, 5 stacks maintained. I would consider keeping your primary damage over time effects on your front bar, that way you can consistently light attack, weave, and maintain this buff. Another consideration is the Mundus Stone choice. Since no longer using Medusa's Mother Sorrow combination, it'll lower your critical rating significantly. Thus, I switched to the Thief and fully buff with the Sorcerer providing Minor Prophecy and a precise trait on my Fire Staff. I was right around 60% spell critical, the sweet spot. Speaking of Medusas, you can continue to use this set if this is too complicated and you struggle with light attack weaving or complex rotation. Moreover, you're going to want to find a source of minor force if you drop Medusa. For the vast majority of players, you won't reach anywhere close to the cap of 125% critical damage, especially not using the Shadow Mundus Stone. Thus, 2 skills I'd recommend are from the Sigil Order Channeled Acceleration or the Fighters Guild Barb Trap. Channeled Acceleration is great because you can pre-cast it. It doesn't require a target, but has a long cast time and also has a long buff time. Barb Trap, on the other hand, is a great option for melee damage dealers like my Magic Templar or a Dragon Knight who are constantly in the front of the enemy. It does require a target. The Banish the Wicked passive gives you ultimate generation when you kill an enemy with the Fighters Guild ability slotted, thus I put it on my front bar. Moreover, the Slayer passive gives you 3% spell damage per Fighters Guild ability slotted, so another reason to front bar Barb Trap and or Flawless Dawnbreaker on Magicka Builds. What I'd recommend using for a Magic Templar is Deadly Strikes from Cyrodiil Broom of Ender. The 2 through 4 piece is now going to give you spell damage and spell critical, and the 5 piece is going to do increased damage for damage over time effects and channel ability. Perfect for your typical jab spammer. Another great option, and one that I use on my Magic Dragon Knight that you could use essentially on every class, is Burning Spell Weave from City Ash 1 or 2. The 5 piece, when you deal damage with a flame damage ability, you apply Burning status effect to the enemy and increase your weapon and spell damage by 490 for 8 seconds. Though it does have a downside, and that's that the effect can occur every 12 seconds, so you can't maintain 100% uptime. The Burning status effect is a damage over time of about 4 seconds, and the damage from this can really add up. Not to mention Monster Helm scale off of spell damage, making it a great pairing. And the Burning status effect directly contributes to the Magic Dragon Knight sustain loop via the Combustion passive, making another great alternative. And lastly, another option is Togvin's Warband from Phosphol. The 5 piece, when you deal critical damage, you gain a stack of precision, increasing your crit chance for 5 seconds up to 10 stacks. At max stacks, you gain minor force, increasing your critical damage done by 10%. This effect can occur every half second. So essentially, this gives you better uptime on minor force and massive amount of critical chance at 10 stacks. The downside is, well, you need 10 stacks, not 5 stacks like Kinross. Consider this a well-rounded alternative to Kinross, which might be easier to maintain if you miss light attacks. And you can always fall back on Medusas if you don't have this and or you want something easier and simpler. If we were to take a look at the best in slot gear chart, this is what I'd go with. I'd go with the monster helm like Kelnar's that's simply set and forget. I would use 2 medium on the monster helm and shoulders for the passive dexterity and agility, giving me more spell damage and giving me more critical rating. Moreover, this 2 medium would help me reduce the sustain needed to be around 25 to 50% range for max effectiveness of Bahase. I'd go with all Divine's traits, light armor, and the rest with max Magicka glyphs on the body. Jewelry traits would be bloodthirsty all the way, with an infused backbar Veteran Maelstrom Arena Fire Staff. I'd enchant that to get spell damage in unstable wall fire combination. The front bar I'd run Precise over Charge Trait. Charge Trait is an incredible option now because its ability to apply the status effect and a fire enchant, you'll get a ton of damage single target. But Precise all around is still my go-to trait because it applies to everything. Ultimately, this is what works for me and can work on every single class with a lot of flexible options depending on what you're playing and the ease of access in which you have of obtaining this gear. Experiment. Find out what works for you. Ultimately, it's your build, and leave me a comment on what I missed and or what you use instead. Also, if you like this video, hit that like, subscribe, consider becoming a Patreon as this really helps support my channel and continue to crank out these videos. Thanks for watching.